ultimately some of the products are ragged over in the UAE, brought back into Australia for people to buy. So there's an example of the circular economy that we are trying to do more ragging locally.
Yes.
Because it seems kind of ludicrous that's the model that happens.
Welcome to Janelle Osenton. Janelle worked in WA government as a waste policy officer in London, in Canada, in New South Wales, as a consultant with HIDA, as a waste minimisation specialist, as a mum, with Talis for 4 years, and now with Good Sammy's for over 2 years. She's got over 20 years experience working with the reuse, recycling, waste industry in Australia, UK and Canada. She's had experience across the entire waste cycle and has the slightly dubious career highlight of attending over 100 resource recovery and landfill facilities. She's now applying that knowledge to help shift to a circular economy in WA, primarily for household goods such as clothing, plastic containers and books, and using carbon footprinting to help justify the need to slow the consumerism trend. Welcome to Talis. Or should I say welcome back to Talis?
Yes, thank you. It's great to be back.
Excellent. So look, as a skeptic in relation to a lot of different things that I deal with, I was wondering whether you could introduce me to the circular economy, what it means to you and what it entails for industry.
Sure, I'll try to make you not a skeptic by the end of this session. So in its simplest sense, I think the circular economy is about keeping material in circulation for as long as possible. And the difference between it and some of the other frameworks is that the various diagrams that we associate with the circular economy step out how we keep materials in circulation for longer. One of the biggest aspects of that is design. So it's about designing out materials from the beginning of the process, and that might be saying you don't need that product at all, or it might be lightweighting of a material. It might be working out how you can make that product appropriate for remanufacture to keep it in circulation longer. So there's a number of different ways that you can create a circular economy to keep products in the system for as long as possible. The circular economy is something that people have had a challenge getting their head around. There was a recent study that said there's 221 different definitions of the circular economy. And I think the reason for that is that applying the concept of keeping materials in circulation as long as possible applies differently depending on the industry that you're in. And there's some purists who feel that you're not really in the circular economy unless you're a manufacturer that can end-to-end control the product design, and use whatever products they've got back in remanufacturing that product. But I think we're a long way off that ultimate view of the circular economy, and that means there's only ever a few people that can be involved with that. The more important aspect of the circular economy is to acknowledge that it takes everybody in the community to play a role from a household level, but also there's a strong role for government, there's a strong role for really any type of business, whether you're an office worker that can influence procurement, whether you're a construction worker that's using products out on site, or in probably the simplest and truest definition of it, a manufacturer that end-to-end can try to take control over their process to minimise their materials.
So you said that we're not at that sort of end-to-end place in the economy just yet, or the development of the economy. Whereabouts would you say we are?
Well, I think different organisations are at different points in that, and it's going to be something that continues to evolve, because until waste is designed out of the system, there's always room to improve the circular economy. Like, to give a really practical example up front, because I was recently on a plane and I reflected on how the airline industry has reduced the amount of material that it produces, and same for like even hotels and the hospitality industry from a catering perspective. That organisations like that, where you used to hop on a plane, you'd be given a little kit with your toothbrush and things in it. Everyone would be given a meal. You'd possibly been given drinks that you wouldn't use. Now, particularly our airlines, but quite a few airlines have tried to reduce the amount of materials and make sure that everything's reusable. So things like the trays are reused, the types of packaging that come with the food should either be compostable or recyclable. They use recycling much more often on planes, whereas they previously couldn't because of some restrictions. So there's been ways that the airline industry has been able to design out waste. Same for hotels, where instead of everybody having these small bottles and cleaning every room every day, people are now aware of the way that their behaviour, but also decisions that a hotel can make to reduce waste and reduce impact on the environment by designing that out of their product offering and encouraging people to opt in if they want it, rather than having a heap of product there that ultimately gets thrown out because people never wanted that bread roll or that sugar or that stirrer or whatever it was in the first place.
So my first dose of scepticism, and maybe this is just around the terms that are being used, but this feels to me like it's sustainability in its core. It's waste minimisation. It's ensuring that we are reducing the amount of material, product, whatever it is that we use and consume. And I guess from first principles as an enviro, that's what we were always sort of taught to do. You reduce. Well, you remove and you reduce. So what are the differences between, I guess, the circular economy and, I guess, the traditional linear economy and those sustainability initiatives that we learnt about at university?
Yeah, I guess there's probably a few parts to that, in that it is about sustainability in its broadest sense, but sustainability is another of those terms that people have interpreted in different ways. And I think the circular economy, where it's presented with a diagram, which obviously is a podcast medium we don't have access to, but if anybody Googles the circular economy diagrams, it's about stepping through how you achieve that and how you achieve that sustainable outcome. Ultimately, a circular economy is about us preserving our raw materials in a sustainable way, because we don't have an endless amount of raw products that we can continue to demand on. So it's recognising that there's a limit to that, and we need to think strategically about how we're going to reduce our impact on the environment. And this gives a practical roadmap for people to use as a starting point as a business to work out how are they going to apply that to reduce their impact on raw materials.
So it's a philosophical term. As much as anything else, it provides that roadmap rather than explaining an economical or an economy concept in its own right. It is, as you say, it's that roadmap to reducing and removing some of that waste from a process that we otherwise might forget about.
Yeah, I don't think that there is one one rule book, because it will apply differently to...
Well, with 221 definitions, I guess there's going to be 221 different rule books.
And there'll be even more, because by the time people... So my reflection on... So that question about how does it tie into sustainability, how does it tie into all of these other ESG, climate change, all of these other drivers that as a community we're working towards, is that I don't think businesses will actively go and seek out how they can become circular. A lot of them will be drawn into it because it's either a procurement requirement, it comes out of their mandatory climate reporting, it applies to their ESG reporting standards, it might be part of a recycling target. So in trying to achieve whatever one of those other frameworks it is, they will arrive at trying to reduce their impact through implementing a circular economy. And broadly, as society, we've got different roles as to how we might do that. And so, my other reflection, having consulted for well over 10 years, is that when we send out a report to a client, sometimes it will come back with just a few little tweaks here and there, and fundamentally it doesn't change the report. But for a client to understand and take ownership over what you're telling them, they put their stamp on it. And so in the same way with a circular economy, if we want people to be able to understand and engage with the concept, then I suspect the reason there's 221 definitions is that people try to understand it, grapple with it, take ownership over it. And if that's what it takes to engage with what a circular economy means and how they'll apply it, then that's actually an important part of stepping out how an individual or an organisation will make its contribution towards a broader circular economy.
So it's a definition that arguably needs to suit the whoever's implementing the circular economy for their own industry or whatever it is, rather than one size fits all. And I guess coming back to sort of the ESG comment you made, all of those standards have different metrics that you've got to align with, whether it's GRI or anything like that. There's a whole suite of different metrics you have to align with to meet ESG requirements. And the same, I guess, is this could be said for waste management and sustainability. So what I want to know then is there have to be some underlying core principles around circular economy that sort of are common to all of those different definitions and nuances.
So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is the one that I think is most globally recognised as setting a universally accepted standard around circular economy. They create great guidelines. They've also got a great podcast that works through how all these different frameworks might apply in different settings. Their diagram is called the butterfly diagram, and I think the reason that other diagrams came out of it is that the Ellen MacArthur butterfly diagram has a lot of layers to it and a lot of complexity, where one part of the butterfly is about the renewables, sort of an organic series of loops where there's a regenerative loop around things like composting, biodegradables and other renewables that can continue to be recirculated in a similar format. The other side is what they call a technical loop, which is more about the non-renewables and the products. And most reiterations of the model focus on the technical loop, which is the one that we are more sort of familiar with on a day-to-day basis in terms of the take, make, waste model of getting a product, using it, and then it largely would end up either in recycling or, in landfill. Or may kind of come back into the loop somewhere in one other life. Whereas what the Ellen MacArthur diagram does in loops that sort of head out is prioritise things like reuse, repair, remanufacture, regeneration, and trying to make those loops as small as possible so that you're reducing transport and the impacts of that. You're reducing all of the other inputs that go into manufacturing a product, like water and energy and all of those things that allow it to cross over into all of these other environmental areas. But coming back to your question that I still haven't answered, which is what are the three core principles that Ellen MacArthur Foundation relies on. So their three fundamental principles are about eliminating waste and pollution, about circular products and material at their highest value, using materials at their highest value, and regenerating nature. So those are the three high-level principles that apply when you're trying to look at designing waste out of a product. So it's not just the waste that we consider in terms of solid waste that ends up in landfill. It's talking about waste in the sense of water pollution, air pollution,
energy efficiency,
all of those other things that have a significant impact.
Okay. And presumably that regenerating nature side of things is the end goal. Is that what it's intended by that?
Yeah, and ideally we can preserve the nature that does still exist in its original form and not continue to exploit it, so that we do have some of that. We're not constantly drawing on more resources than what the Earth has, because I guess that's the other framework that is also fairly popular at the moment, is around planetary boundaries.
Yes.
And the fact that we are, particularly as Australians, exceeding the planetary boundaries in April every year. And we need to look at that and understand what it means, because as Australians we are huge consumers, and We need to take responsibility for that, because a lot of the impact of Australian products is experienced by other countries. Sorry, products that we consume as Australians is ultimately borne by other countries. And to some extent, that's the issue for textiles, which is the area that I'm in at the moment, which is 8 to 10% of carbon emissions globally. We don't manufacture a lot of clothing end to end here, actually a very small proportion of it. But a lot of those emissions, a lot of the water that comes out of clothing, a lot of the dyeing processes, all of the pollution, potentially the social impacts around low. I'm not going to use the term slave labour, but poor labour conditions.
Impoverished.
Is something that we contribute to here, depending on our procurement choices. So keeping those products here in Australia from a reuse perspective, or even trying to recycle them locally, rag them locally, starts to tighten those loops and reduce our impact on the environment.
So there's a big element of product stewardship associated with all of that, particularly where we as Australians are manufacturing something. We've got to understand what the ultimate implications of that are, but also what we're accepting into the country for our own consumption.
Yes, and I think product stewardship is a significant solution to all of these things, but particularly the circular economy, because it allows more of a level playing field.
Yep.
It means that it allows organisations to look at a standard that can be designed around product stewardship, and it also means that you can address some of the products that have a higher impact.
Yep. You mentioned your work at the moment in the textiles industry, which I'd like to ask you about a little bit later on. But in terms of the circular economy, are there any common misconceptions that are prevalent out there, or any trade-offs in moving to that sort of model?
Yeah, I think one of the common misconceptions is that it's recycling, which it's much more than just recycling, because that's where the design element comes in. Recycling's a bit like within the waste hierarchy. Recycling should be one of the later parts of the solution that does, if we do have materials that are needed, if they are either compostable or recyclable, or able to be reused and remanufactured in some way, then that's optimal. So it really emphasises that the circular economy is about designing out waste where possible, and not just using what we've got and hoping you can recycle it and find an alternative to landfill. The other misconception is this one that really it's up to manufacturers to solve the problem and the rest of us don't have to worry about it. But as you would know, from a government perspective or a consulting perspective, there's a lot of purchasing power that impacts what manufacturers will do. So the rest of us that are involved in buying or using any product can drive the circular economy by making sure that we specify that a product is manufactured in a more sustainable way, or looking at how that manufacturer is taking responsibility for end of life of that product, or how we as a user, if we're consuming a significant amount of a product, might take more responsibility about how we would use it end to end and get it back to that manufacturer.
You mentioned government just then, and I'm always interested particularly interested at the moment around the environmental legislation that they seem to be tweaking, particularly in WA. But what role do government policies play in promoting or hindering circular practices? And then I guess the follow-up question is, when times get tight, and we're obviously in a great economy in WA, I think it's just been announced that we're leading the way from an economical perspective in Australia. When times get tight, will this drop away? Well, we see it with industry from time to time. Environment's the most important thing in the world until it's not. So what policies will, I guess, what role does government policy play? And do you think that will be a continuation? Do you think it'll be sustainable from their perspective?
Two quite different questions there to some extent. I think government play a role through procurement, but also through a whole heap of standards that exist that might create a business as usual system.
Yep.
And it means that it might be restrictive for people to be able to introduce new business methods, or from a procurement perspective, if the government put out a significant tender or even a tender panel that specifies things to be done a certain way and people don't comply with that, but they actually might have a better model, there needs to be some openness to understanding an end-to-end procurement model and having the flexibility around that.
That's often really, really hard when you're innovative. By definition, no one's really done it before. And I guess, again, skeptic point number 2, government isn't really good at dealing with innovation because no one's done it before. They're often very reluctant to sort of say, yes, that's going to work, we'll take a chance on it.
Yep. And you're highlighting the exact barrier because that is essentially what you come up against all of the time. So from a circular economy perspective, it is going to require breaking some models where that's tested. And we've seen it play out in WA from a construction point of view with roads and understanding aggregates, same in the building sector. These are significant infrastructure opportunities, and they do have risks if things aren't done well. From a contamination perspective, which would be what you're used to dealing with, is these perceptions around leaching of composts or aggregates, and there might be standards that exist, but those standards might require a standard that's above what the normal levels of things. So on a daily basis, you would be dealing with this where there are rules that are in place that might not actually make sense for that situation. And it is inherently difficult for government and to create a level playing field where there's some grey areas there. But I do think there's a way to allow for procurement that can create a fair and transparent procurement system, but also be open to looking at all of the other important roles and targets within government about protecting the environment, reducing waste, keeping products in circulation longer, reducing carbon emissions. One of the mechanisms might be around having a procurement criteria that relates to environmental impacts, and that would look different depending on what the specification relates to. We haven't really talked about the mandatory carbon reporting, but I see that as being a big lever that will drive people's awareness and ownership around circular economy, because for a lot of organisations, some of the main contributors to the carbon footprint once they go to scope 3 is landfill, but it's also the upstream and downstream emissions of whatever products are flowing through their organisation. So by having to understand your scope 3 emissions and identifying what are the biggest contributors to your carbon footprint, then you, by nature, reduce your carbon footprint by reducing the amount of resources that you're using, and that requires you to be circular in your thinking.
It's interesting, we're dealing with main roads at the moment and dealt with them through materials acceptance sampling plans for basically C&D materials that were going to be used in road base. Sure. Really, really hard, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, to get them to understand the acceptability of certain materials. As you mentioned, the leaching side of things, the risk that they perceived that they were running using this material, and having to go through a very onerous sampling plan for a number of different proponents, which was over the top for what was required, and convince them to bring it back down. You look at what they're doing now, we've got people in main roads at the moment working on circular economy plans and working at where they can reduce their footprint, their carbon footprints, and what they can be doing, I guess, to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, and maybe that is an example of a significant organisation that can have a huge impact on driving the circular economy and bringing a whole heap of other organisations along with it. But it's interesting that they were reluctant for so long, given that in Victoria and New South Wales, there's been government organisations using these products for years and years, maybe not on the same porous environment as they'd argue that WA has, but some equally porous environments. So to some extent, coming back to the original question, which is about what can government do, it's about being more open-minded and looking around at some of those opportunities and looking at where there are restrictions in the policies and the procurement standards that might be limiting our ability to reduce our impact on the environment through circular economy.
So I'm going to switch that around. Specific materials or products. There have to be some, and we've talked about basic raw materials, swapping that out to C&D materials that have been demonstrated to be clean and suitable, fit for purpose. Are there any specific materials that you think, or products that you think are suitable for or lend themselves to the circular economy?
Well, I think the construction industry have the biggest opportunity because there's so much embodied energy in the construction industry, and there's a big opportunity for reuse in the sense that even with high rises now, some models are going towards keeping the footings, keeping the bottom couple of floors, and then just changing the rest of the building around that, so that then you are retaining a lot of the solid footings, literally.
Yep.
And then if the building needs to change purpose around that. So there's a lot of...
So more of a modular sort of approach.
Well, and we are seeing a lot more of that, like modular, built off-site, some ways that the construction industry, probably more driven by cost and efficiency rather than environmental outcomes, has changed their model.
But that's driven also through the basic raw materials, the cost of that, the transport, everything else. So there's upstream costs that are being pushed through to a downstream consumer.
Yeah, that's right. And recognising that there are materials like, for example, steel that was very hard to get during COVID and post-COVID that causes people to think differently. Yep. And raw material prices that are going up around a number of different things that do cause people to think differently. And this comes back to my point of it doesn't necessarily matter what brings people to the circular economy. If we're getting the outcome, then that's the most important thing, and that people will, hopefully, through looking for economic savings, which in some instances occur, realise that there are other ways they can look at their model that might also cut out materials that result in economic savings and improve the process. Other materials, food and organics is one that there's a big push on nationally because the impact of wasted food is significant on all sorts of social and environmental fronts. And so that is one that, as a nutrient poor country when it comes to our agricultural land, if we can make improvements in that area, there's a lot of opportunity. And I think the other consideration around food and organics when we're talking about innovations in the circular economy is potentially the perverse outcomes of some of these mandates where we've got biodegradable or compostable packaging and people inadvertently put binding agents into that product that then become a problem from a leaching perspective.
Sure.
This is where the circular economy is important, and coming back to those principles of eliminating pollution and designing out the problems, because when you are designing your product, you want to make sure that you're not inadvertently creating more waste or pollution. And that might happen through making sure that with your organic products that you're not inadvertently adding something that's ultimately going to leach out. And that would be the same with any of these other design challenges, is what might seem an environmental solution on the surface needs to be truly designing out pollution and hopefully having a suitable end-to-end solution.
So how do we change the habits both of ourselves as consumers but also the producers? I mean, obviously there's questions around changing your upfront materials so that they can be factored into the circular economy, that they're better able to be reused. To some extent, that's going to be driven by their costs as well as the market that they're going to be selling to. And ultimately, we're the ones going to be paying for a lot of these materials. What can we do as, I guess, consumers to change things? And does current cost of living, which is obviously a big issue across the country, is that going to play a role or be a significant factor in terms of those changes that are going to be made?
Yeah, like convenience and cost is what drives consumer behaviour primarily. And there are examples in the circular economy, quite a few that we've talked about today, that do save costs ultimately. So there might be some initial upstream investment that requires a change to the system, but it ultimately reduces the amount of products that need to be purchased and transported and all of the other impacts that go with that, you know, designing out surplus that isn't needed for the demand. So,
but that's I guess there's a lag period associated with that before you get to those cheaper goods and cheaper services and products that you're aiming to purchase.
So I guess a strategic answer and a day-to-day consumer answer.
Yep.
For us as Good Sammys in the donations, charitable reuse space, when there's a cost of living crisis, our business model works quite well because people are more likely to reuse products and buy it secondhand. And historically, people did look at ways they can reuse, whether it was food and pickling and having leftovers and using less packaging, because at the time it was more expensive where there was more packaging, refillable bottles. And same with household products. You would repair them because it cost more than $30 to go and replace your toaster or your kettle. So where there's a cost of living crisis, then it does mean that people do look to extend the life of their product and think about it a little bit longer. I
was going to, not being glib about it, but it's a positive thing in certain ways. Because it is forcing people to think about making changes that otherwise they might have just said, you know what, we can buy a new one.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any advantage to a cost of living crisis, but in the sense that there is, it a bit like COVID, it causes people to break their take, make, waste model, because there isn't just this endless supply of things.
That's right.
And so there is an upside to that. And looking at it from a more strategic perspective, what are the things that need to change? Early on, you mentioned extended producer responsibility schemes. I would like to see, if in 1st of July this year, the federal government, cancelled these nuisance taxes, and the nuisance taxes were import duties that applied to essentially all the products that are on the voluntary extended producer responsibility schemes and on all of the high target material costs. So things like mattresses, shoes, clothing, batteries, all of these things that have become quite fast consumer goods. Yep. Mattresses arguably aren't a fast consumer good, but they are something that people buy when they've got more money to. There was a simple, they wouldn't like me calling it simple, but simple relative to introducing 40 different producer responsibility schemes. If we just applied import duties back at a high enough percentage to take into account those life cycle costs, that would then advantage a local economy, advantage the Australian businesses that are trying to do the right thing in a transparent way and meeting standards. And it could all be administered through a government system that allows those resources to be apportioned back appropriately for environmental mitigation, waste management, and absorb those costs back into the system in a more appropriate user pays way that prevents some of this fast consumer goods and ultra fast consumer goods, which we're increasingly seeing, taxing it at the gate, slowing the tap down, and making it accountable at our borders, which is what the US does and increasingly what some of the European countries are doing on problematic materials. Because we're an island that's always going to need to import certain things, but we have mechanisms to try to control that. And it was really disappointing that up until a couple of months ago we had that mechanism and we've dropped it, and we're now going to go down the path of a much more onerous route of trying to get all of these voluntary producer responsibility schemes that will then become mandated responsibility schemes that will then be managed by all sorts of organisations that have vested interests in the outcomes.
Sure.
Rather than just putting that tax back in and having it applied in a potentially more independent way. But anyway, that was my little lobbying aspect for the solution to the world's problem.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time, so I want to get you to sort of speak a little bit about your role at Good Sammys. I'm interested in why you made the jump from consulting and I guess the government roles that you've had into a little bit more of an altruistic sort of role with Good Sammys, and how you see that fitting in with, I guess, definitions and descriptions we've discussed today.
Yeah, so the role at Good Sammys, it came up a couple of years ago in that, under a new leadership at Good Sammys, Kane Blackman, the now CEO, recognised the circular economy opportunity, which is that circular economy is about not just the environmental aspects, but improving the flow of goods, materials and money into the system. So where you are reusing or recycling, reuse is 25 times more jobs than recycling and 30 times more jobs than landfill. So Good Sammy's WA social enterprise, 29 retail stores in WA, and we're primarily a disability employer. So we're trying to create meaningful employment for people with a disability, and those donations that we receive from the community, we can add value to those by using our staff to help to do things with them, which each of the charitable reuse organisations, Salvos, Vinnies, Red Cross, Lifeline, all have a charitable purpose through their reuse, which is funded through that. Where those organisations are dependent on volunteers, it's a little bit more challenging for them to necessarily upcycle or optimise some of those materials. We have an opportunity to do that through our disability employment model. And so my job, and also our previous colleague Jenny, we look at what we can do with things like some of the books, some of the clothing in particular, to try to work on partnerships and use our staff to try to recover more value from that, and particularly try and recover more value locally. Because the reality is Australia is consuming a huge amount of products, and it's more than what we can sell locally because people just aren't buying enough secondhand. They're buying the cheap new stuff.
Yes, fast fashion and whatever else.
If Australians bought more secondhand product, we wouldn't need to export, because we export our surplus goods that don't fit into the charitable reuse stores at the moment.
Wow, okay. Yep. And where are they going?
So we track each of our ships, and we've got 2 exporters who are accredited through the charitable reuse export accreditation scheme. They are currently exporting, both of those organisations, through to the United Arab Emirates, which ironically is where Bunnings buy most of their rags from, because ultimately some of the products are ragged over in the UAE, brought back into Australia for people to buy. So there's an example of the circular economy that we are trying to do more ragging locally.
Yes.
Because it seems kind of ludicrous that's the model that happens. And it's about labour costs. It's about that when we send those products, whether they go to Pakistan, UAE or Malaysia, when those products get into those tertiary sorting facilities, they sort into 216 categories by colour, by grade, by clothing type, to then get those products to different markets. And our Australian labour model, the size of our warehouses or backs of stores, doesn't allow us to sort to that grade. But that is one of the main projects that we're looking at, is around a local textile recycling partnership, ragging on site ourselves, washing and drying some more of our product, particularly wet stock that comes in, because we can't put wet stock in with anything else because it will mould it. And then a whole heap of sort of upcycling and design projects with some of the universities and TAFEs in the area.
Fantastic. One last question. What are we doing well in relation to the circular economy, or what is Good Sammys doing well, and where would you like us as consumers to focus on? I mean, we can't have everything, but is there a focal point that we should be thinking about?
I mean, Australia does have a lot of opportunities in this space as an island and as a raw material producer in a huge way. And I think that's where the government can pull a heap of levers to try to preserve our raw materials for as long as possible. So far we've just subsidise it and use it as a way to continue our economic growth, but we have an opportunity to play a pretty strategic role globally and to preserve those resources for a bit longer.
Yep.
And so from a consumer perspective, it is really about valuing what we buy, thinking about our decisions, and obviously with my good Sammy's hat on, encouraging people to think secondhand. Like increasingly we'll put our stores in a strip where there's a few secondhand stores so that people can go and buy their pre-loved goods. If they can't find it in that store, hopefully it'll be in the one next door or the one after that. And all of us now have online stores so that you can purchase your goods from home, which is one of the reasons that we've got all this surplus. A lot of the stock will come to us even with brand new tags on it, because people will sit online, buy it, get 3 sizes and give the extra 2 to us rather than return them to the manufacturer. So we've moved our model also to being online so that hopefully it can be more convenient for people to buy secondhand goods where they want to.
Compete with stores like Depop and all of those sort of places, which we've only just discovered and having a great time with. Really appreciate you coming in, Janelle. That was really, really useful. Thanks for your time, and good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. And thanks for amplifying the circular economy message.
Thank you.
All right, see you later.